what we have here is very much live exhibits. I'm delighted to have my friend, Professor Margarita Šešelgytė from the Vilnius University Institute of International Relations, Tony Lawrence from the ICDS in Tallinn, Estonia, and Thomas Rostoks, the director of the Center for Security and Strategic Research at the National Defense Academy of Latvia. And I'm Edward Lucas, and I have been to the Baltic states. I want to just kick off with a sort of just a little moment of historical context. March the 27th is the day when in 1981, an Estonian dissident called Jüri Kukk died in the Gulag. And it's something that was at the time I was a student here at LSE. We had a very small gathering of emigres campaigning. I think we were outside the Soviet embassy, and the ideas that the problems we have today, daunting though they may be, and the war in Ukraine is certainly the worst thing to happen in all our lifetime, seems a geological eon away from those grim years of the early 80s. I want to kick off by looking at the way in which the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and the partial invasion that preceded it have changed the threat assessment for the countries in the region. What are we more worried about? Perhaps also what are we less worried about? I was very interested to hear your remarks, sir, about the decrepit nature of the Soviet Navy. I've never forgotten my first visit to a frontline Soviet airbase in Czechoslovakia in December 1981, and having been very scared of the Soviet Western group of forces in what was then the Warsaw Pact, seeing it close to certainly put a different perspective on it. But so what are we more or less scared about? Then I want to get on to the question of NATO and NATO enlargement. We've gone through several phases of NATO's presence in the region, from what I call NATO light or low alcohol NATO after 2004, with only the Baltic air policing and no contingency plans, to slightly more substantial efforts made after Georgia, and the considerably more substantial efforts with enhanced forward presence after 2014. But still, as my friend Jovita was mentioning, we still don't have air defense in the Baltic. We still don't have proper reinforcement plans. There's an enormous amount still to be done in terms of the security of the Baltic states. And then, of course, there's the question of Finland and Sweden, very nice problems to have. How do we integrate Finland and Sweden into regional defense? But this is, if you like, the ingredients are here in the kitchen. We don't have the recipe, and we haven't necessarily started cooking. So there's a lot to talk about on that. And then there's also, I've been asked just to touch on energy security. And that gets into a much wider question, both about physical resilience, about the business models of our energy industries, about the whole of society response on that front. I'm not going to follow the example of my dear friend Eitvydas Barajūnas, who grotesquely exploited his diplomatic immunity by stealing 15 minutes from my session. So this one will finish. This one will finish on time, and a démarche is waiting for you when you get back to the embassy. So I'm going to go to Margarita first, and we'll go a quick round on the threat assessment. What are we more scared of, and what are we less scared of?
Before we start,
However did we win the Cold War?
That will take some time, you know, from our session. Thank you, Edward, and I'm very grateful for the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here. So about the threat assessment, I'm always telling to my colleagues from abroad who come to Lithuania and ask about how we live with such a big threat just across our border. I guess the level of acceptance of risk in Baltic countries is a bit higher than in many other countries. Putin's constantly blackmailing Western societies with nuclear, and talking to people in Lithuania, we are not so much afraid of nuclear, although it's very close to us. So I think that the threat assessment in those countries is a bit different. Although when we go back to 2014, 2008, we always have been thinking of Russia as of a threat, which was not the case in other countries. Now we can be proud, or probably it's not proud, it's unfortunately was the situation, we told you so. But, and at the beginning of war, I know that many people in Lithuania were considering leaving the country, and some of them were leaving, being afraid that the war would come to Lithuania, although we are members of EU and NATO. But now 1 year has passed, and we've learned some lessons, and there are some things that we are still afraid, and then there are some still that we're less afraid. There were a lot of, were some good things, bad things, and ugly things. So the good things that the European Union and in general extended Western community stand united in their support for Ukraine. There is a financial support, there is a military support, and this gives a sense of security for us that the war in Ukraine might end with Ukraine winning. There are also sanctions, ICC decision, which recognized Putin as a criminal. So we are moving forward, and the things that we were so much afraid that the unity would crack, and that what was Putin hoping didn't happen. So we are less afraid of that. There were bad things. It appeared that we're entirely unprepared militarily, that our decision-making is very long and not timely, that there is a lot of greed all over Europe. The companies, the countries were not very firm on sanctions. Some of the companies moved their business to the countries like Turkey, trying to circumvent the sanctions. So there is still a number of greed, and that gives some food for thought. And then there are a lot of ugly things about this war. People are dying. More than 300,000 people, kids, were brought from Ukraine to Russia for re-education. That's ugly. Things what happened in Bucha was very ugly. And that gave us also some food for thought, because if we would be considering some kind of a situation that we have to defend ourselves, that Russia occupies us and then NATO comes and save us, which was the scenario, defense scenario prior to the war in Ukraine, we would be facing lots of Buchas in Baltic countries. So that's that we are still afraid. But now we look what's going to happen in the future, and then we can face 3 scenarios. One is good, one is bad, and the other is ugly. So the good scenario is that Ukraine wins. Probably Iron Curtain just falls down in Russia and Ukraine. There are reparations, there is international justice, and Russian officials probably, at least if they are not brought directly to justice, but they are condemned. No back to normal. Europe is more resilient, has less vulnerabilities in terms of its interdependencies with Russia, invests more in defense, takes more leadership in defense, and well, is less vulnerable and more resilient towards the attacks of the authoritarian countries. That's a good scenario, so we would like to see a scenario like that. But what we see today, that fatigue start to hit, and support for Ukraine is getting less and less. It's more difficult to get, first of all, financial support, but what is even more important, to get the military support, because it's not only about the money, but ability to produce. And we don't have much time, and we are looking for the breakthrough in Ukraine, but this breakthrough has to happen very soon, because if the fatigue starts to hit, Ukrainian forces are also suffering a lot. It's not that easy to get new people to fight, and those people who are fighting are starting to get tired, and we might be facing a scenario which is quite grim. A frozen conflict on the ground, eternal frozen conflict on the ground, where part of the Ukraine is in the green zone, and Ukraine doesn't have EU membership, Ukraine doesn't have NATO membership, and there is no rebuild of Ukraine, because if you do not have NATO and EU guarantees, it's very difficult to convince companies to come and invest in rebuilding of Ukraine. And that's a very bad scenario, because it's bad for Europe, it's bad for this region. And what's ugly about that? The ugly part of it, that I see this war, although it is a bad thing to have a war, it is ugly to have a war, as a window of opportunity for the West countries to change the mindset that you have to defend your democratic values, way of life, also using the military might. You have to be very clear on where you stand, and you have to understand that trading with the authoritarians, being interdependent with the authoritarians, makes you very vulnerable and makes you and your societies very vulnerable. Energy resources, this is an opportunity to change to a more greener options, to also open new cooperation with other regions. And if we see Ukraine losing, we're not taking these opportunities and not using these windows of opportunities and not having lessons learned. And where does it end? There are two things which are very ugly, that, as Jovita already was mentioning, maybe after 5-7 years, when Russia is reviving, they're very creative. We might be seeing conflict coming to NATO, and we might be seeing war happening within NATO, and then it's going to be even more ugly. And another very important point, that's a bad message, a bad signal to the European countries and Westerners in general, that those countries, the authoritarian countries, will learn that the might is right, and the new world order probably will be written by China in cooperation with Russia. So that's the ugly thing, and that's what we fear. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to ask Tom's next, moving north from Lithuania to Latvia. Don't feel any need to repeat points that Margarita has made, although you could just agree with them. But I'm very interested to know your perspective, particularly on what NATO, how we deal with the challenge and the opportunities of NATO enlargement. But do give us your thoughts on the first assessment as well, particularly they're different from Margarita's.
Okay, I just received my launching orders from the moderator, and I'll try to do my best here. But before I proceed with what has just been requested, there are a few things that I would like to mention about European security architecture and security order, which is the subject of this panel discussion. And there are quite a few things there. So irrespective of how this war will end, and we don't really know at this point, I do hope, though, that towards the end of this year, we'll have a much better understanding where this war is going. It might not be over by the end of the year, but we will have some idea how it will probably end. So, but before the start of the war, I think it's fairly important to go back to the month that preceded the war. And there are a lot of things that we've learned about Russia. And although I never really trusted Russia personally, there were a few things that still surprised me. Their readiness to accept high casualties. If I was told a year and a half ago that there might be about, let's say, 150,000 Russians who have died in Ukraine in a military conflict, I would have thought that, well, now, how is that possible at all? Because our point of reference were, in a way, our own experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. So several thousand of our troops died, NATO troops. So talking about 150 is just, surprising, and that's just an approximate number. Ukrainians say it's higher, and then you have to add the mobilized from Luhansk and Donetsk and so on. So we don't really know what the exact number is, and we might never actually learn that number. But again, going back to the pre-war situation, there were two tracks going on. So one track was the military track. So Russia was clearly preparing for war. Russia was ticking almost every box in war preparations. And many concluded from that Russia was really not just preparing for invasion, but that it will invade. On the other hand, there were Russia's demands that were communicated in December 2021. And I think that one thing that is somewhat puzzling is the actual significance that Russia lent its, those were not diplomatic efforts, that was clearly an ultimatum. And it seems that Russia's demands were constructed in such a way that its demands would be rejected, it would be deemed unacceptable, and so on and so forth. But still, apparently there was something about European security order that Russia deemed unacceptable. And for years, it was putting some effort into trying to obtain what it wanted with non-military means. With military means against Georgia, Ukraine, but elsewhere with hybrid means, so to say. So that is, I think, still one unresolved aspect of the conflict, whether Russia wanted really to pursue a diplomatic, although in a form of an ultimatum, path before the war or not. Eventually, Russia did what it did. I think that today the question is about how do we preserve the European security order. And for us, and that's also the reason why European security order will remain divided. Although I think if you would, let's say, put a number of politicians in Western Europe on the couch, and if you would ask them, would you like to be the one who is finally able to normalize, let's say, security relations with Moscow, so that Europe is not divided, but it's whole, perhaps not free, but at peace? And I think that there are many who would deem that option attractive still, not with Putin. But if you think about this in a very, very long-term perspective, then how do we achieve lasting security? And eventually, at some point, there will be calls, that will be after Putin, but there will be calls about pursuing peace with Russia and building a security order from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We haven't heard these talks lately, but I'm pretty sure that there will be such calls at some point. Again, they will resurface after the war. But then Europe will remain divided, largely because of three reasons. So first reason, and I'll do that very shortly. The first reason is that we don't feel entirely confident and secure on the EU and NATO side, although that might be paradoxical, because we will be dealing with a severely weakened Russia, but also with a more aggressive Russia. And since large-scale war has become a reality in Europe, we are afraid that this might happen again, that Russia might reload in 5 or 6 or 7 years and try again. The second reason why I think that sort of coming to terms with Russia and including it in whatever way in European security order would be impossible is the issue of responsibility and accountability. And despite the fact that we should pursue, we should hold Russia accountable, but irrespective of how this war ends, you can only hold Russia accountable in a proper way. Reparations, let's say, trying Russian military and political leaders for war crimes. This is where you need actually cooperation from Russia. Because after all, there's not going to be a European or NATO police force going to Moscow and starting to arrest individuals there. So there will be no accountability, and we will ask for it. And there will be all sorts of incentives for the Russians not to accept them. And I think that finally, the final point is really simple. There's no trust whatsoever. It's been mentioned a number of times already. And whatever agreements Russia would sign with whoever, EU, NATO, Ukraine, there's just no reason to treat that as something that will put limits on Russia's policies and its use of force in Europe. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Thomas. And I think that idea of a Russia weaker but also more aggressive is a really useful framing concept, because we have a lot of people saying because Russia's weaker, it would have to be less aggressive, because presumably it's got less to be aggressive with. But actually, for a country of Russia's size, that's not a paradox. That's just a twist of fate. I want in the discussion to get on a little bit to what we think about post-war, post-Putin Russia, and how to deal with it. I have a quiz, by the way, and I think if anybody in the audience recognizes this flag, they should see me later, and I will give them some small sign of recognition. It's quite a tricky question, but this is when we're talking about the future of Russia, these are the sort of things we need to know. Tony, let's go to you next. Feel free to contribute any thoughts you have either on the threat assessment or on how we do NATO expansion, or on anything else that has been on your mind.
Some kind of a circassian, no?
So thank you, Ed, and thank you also to the organisers for the opportunity to be here. It's a real privilege and a pleasure. I'll start with the threat because Ed, your opening question was what's changed in our threat assessment, and basically I would say it hasn't. I mean, since the Baltic states regained their independence back in the early 90s, the idea of a military threat from Russia has always been dominant in Baltic security thinking. always this expectation that sometime Russia would do something in Europe that would be bad for all of us, and you know that narrative, that thought has persisted all the way through this period of the post-Cold War. So Russia's full-scale invasion was certainly a shock in its scale and its brutality. And it certainly underlined the shortfalls that we in the Baltic region have in terms of dealing with this kind of threat, the military shortfalls in terms of things like air defense, long-range fires. But basically, you know, this was, if not expected, then certainly not written off. But maybe it's worth thinking a little bit about to what extent Russia remains a threat in the Baltic region today. And you know, in defense analysis terms, we often consider threat to be a combination of intent and capability. So what you want to do and whether you have the means to do it. And when it comes to intent, well, there's no indication at all that Russia has stepped back from the aims it has itself for recasting the European security architecture. These were set out in the draft treaties that Tom's mentioned, that were presented to the US and NATO in December 2021. They asked for things like the withdrawal of US nuclear weapons from Europe. They asked for the removal of equipment and weapons from those states that had joined NATO after 1997. They asked for guarantees that NATO wouldn't further expand. And the effect of all of these would have been to encode security divisions in Europe and to degrade the security of many of the Eastern allies. And as we've seen, Russia is prepared to go to war for these for this agenda. So I don't think we should be under any illusion that you know, that Russia has an intent to recast European security in its own image. And we also shouldn't be under any illusion that you know, looking at the war in Ukraine, that Russia is quite ready to take absolutely disastrous decisions based on miscalculations and flawed assumptions in order to pursue this agenda. Capability is a slightly more complicated story. I mean, material and personnel losses in the war have been huge. We don't know the figures. The best estimates that I've seen for Russian casualties is about 200,000 now. That's wounded and killed. And you know, that's bigger than the original invasion force. If you take the highest estimates for the size of the original invasion force, about 190,000, and now here we are at 200,000 casualties. And it's not just numbers, but it's who's been lost. I mean, senior commanders at an extraordinary rate. Special forces, those elite units that were deployed on Baltic borders until quite recently, things like the 1st Guards Tank Army and the 6th Combined Arms Army. You know, Russia has lost its spearhead force, and you can't simply go and get these people off the streets and put them into an army and think you're going to continue to be effective. Another aspect of capability is how you use the assets that you have. And the Russian armed forces, as we know, have shown some absolutely spectacular failings in their prosecution of the war. They failed to establish air superiority. They failed to provide logistic support for their troops. They failed to coordinate the arms that were involved in their various operations. And these are armed forces that supposedly saw these same lessons in 2008 in Georgia and prioritized investment ever since then to correct these mistakes. And yet still they've failed. And there's a very open question as to what extent Russia will learn the lessons that it's supposed to have learned this time around. At the moment, we can see them changing tactics in the war to respond to how Ukraine is operating. But whether they will actually absorb these, write them into doctrine, train for them in the future really remains to be seen. Now, observations like these have led to this narrative that perhaps we don't need to worry too much about Russia as a military threat. And this is something that is definitely rejected as a narrative in the Baltic region. Firstly, because it's fair to assume that once this war is over, Russia will prioritize the reconstitution of its armed forces. Russia places high value on military as an instrument of state power. We've seen this in Chechnya, in Syria, in Ukraine since 2014, in Georgia. We see it in the Baltic region as well, where below the threshold of war, Russia continually uses military instruments to harass and to intimidate the Baltic states. We've seen for decades the Kremlin has invested in its armed forces and not in its economy, which is in dire need of investment. So that would be one point. Second point would be that The three Baltic states are not Ukraine. They're much smaller, much more geographically vulnerable. And Russia, in normal circumstances, far outnumbers and far outguns the Baltic states in the Baltic region. And if Russia wanted to challenge NATO, it could act fairly quickly with small numbers of forces to take Baltic territory and then simply to step back and dare NATO to respond. That's this fait accompli scenario, which we've worried about since sort of 2014-ish, and it hasn't gone away. And the third point would be that even if Russia is militarily weakened, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, Russia has shown itself to be a state that really doesn't care about the use of people as cannon fodder in prosecuting its military aims. So even a weakened Russian army would still not be good for us. So, I mean, to summarize, I don't think the threat assessment has changed that much. NATO needs to respond to this. I was going to talk about NATO's response here, but perhaps I'll leave it for a bit and we'll come back to it later. I'll perhaps leave it at that.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think we've outlined both the unchanging threat assessment in one sense, but some of the nuances that have been added in others. And I think now we should turn to what do we do about it, and particularly the question of NATO enlargement. I'm going to ask the panelists to assume that the difficulties we have with Turkey are temporary, and that we will get round them one way or the other, either because Erdogan loses the election and whoever comes in next lets Sweden in, or because the tactics of the carpet bazaar in Istanbul will come to their usual conclusion, and he will get something from the United States that he wants in return for dropping his opposition, or that we find some other workaround, because we could spend the entire remaining period of this session, and indeed the rest of the week, doing what ifs about how to deal with Sweden's problems with the Turkish and potentially also Hungarian vetoes. So I want to park that and instead just move on to what the second question that we were posed, which is the role of NATO and its enlargement. One can see all sorts of things that we can do. We might want to have a rotating Finnish and Swedish presence in the three Baltic states. I've also heard it suggested that the Estonians should immediately send a company to Finland in solidarity, or put an Estonian company on Gotland in solidarity with the Swedes. This prompted a Swede to recall that the last time the Estonians had a military presence on Gotland, they were there as pirates. And if you visit Gotland, that's why the castles are there in magnificent ancient fortifications. But it's wonderful to put these historical animosities behind us. There's plenty to do in terms of the sort of symbolic swapping of forces, but there's also very big questions, which you touched on, Tony, the things the Baltic states really, really need, which the Baltic states really, really can't afford. The air and missile defenses and the long-range strikes. It would make a lot of sense for other countries to pay for them and to put them in the Baltic states. We saw this with Poland putting its coastal batteries on rotation in Estonia a couple of years ago. That was really good, and we heard the Poles say that the outer perimeter of their security is the Estonian-Russian frontier. But there's an awful lot to do on that. And then the command structure, really complicated command structure. Even people who understand this quite well sometimes struggle to explain the point of having the division between the Latvian and Danish headquarters, the role of the two different, the core and the divisional headquarters in Poland, how that fits into the the American 5 Corps in Poznan, the rotation between Brunssum and Naples, and the role of, and it goes on and on and on. And you could have an entire slide, it would look like a plate of spaghetti hurled at the wall, trying to explain the way in which we do the peacetime command structure. And then you say, of course, in wartime, it all becomes very different. And we've also got this big question about the Americans, touched on this in the previous discussion, the possibility of another President Trump or Trumpian president, but also the inexorable sound, glugging sound of American attention and resources shifting to the Pacific. We are enormously dependent on the American Marine base in Trondheim, But the Marines aren't going to be there forever. Their new role is to be a coastal raiding force in the Pacific. Those vast caves in Norway, full of all sorts of useful kit and equipment, which by some magical means will appear in the Baltic states in the event of a crisis. We need to do some more thinking on that. So there's plenty to chew on, and I'm going to go to each of our three panelists to talk about what we do to make the most of this great opportunity we have of Finnish and Swedish membership, but also what we Europeans do to make up for the change in American priorities and all the other associated questions around it. Margarita, this interesting set of simple problems lands first of all with you.
Thank you.
Would you mind going
Quite
to the
a few-
rostrum?
Okay,
Because for
yes.
the people who are going to watch this on the, it's not the live stream, it's the dead stream. We're going to do this as a on YouTube later on, and people watching will want to be able to see you as well as
The
you.
only problem when I stand here, you assume that I'm lecturing, so I speak longer. So you
That's
have to be
allowed,
very
that's allowed.
harsh with me.
You were admirably economical at the beginning, so
Okay.
don't feel constrained now.
Well, I'll start again with window opportunities. All the set of issues that you've mentioned, I think evolves around this window of opportunity that the Western countries are facing. How to boost the defense and ability to defend ourselves against authoritarian countries, against those countries who have weapons and are trying to use it. So this is the window of opportunity to boost our defense, to spend more smart, to cooperate more between each other and within the international organizations like NATO and the EU, with each of them doing the best what the organization can do. So we've seen this terrible war. That's a new reality, and we started to adapt. And one of the major things of adaptation was enhancing security of the eastern flank. So there were things done before this war already: enhanced forward presence battalions set in 3 Baltic countries and in Poland. Well, some new command structures, new boosting of the defense nationally, increased defense budgets. Okay, first thing was done. Now we have to step forward, and we've seen that Russia is capable, what Russia is capable of doing, and the things that we have is not enough. We need more. So there were things again done. There was a Madrid summit. There was an agreement that these capabilities will be reinforced, at least with the brigade level. Things are struggling, and struggling due to several reasons. Crumbling political will, a certain belief that the war will be over soon, and probably we have to think in these terms. We do not have to invest too much because it's too expensive. And to send the troops to the foreign country, you have to bear in mind that there are 3 phases of rotating the troops. And you send them with the families, it costs a lot. It costs a lot. So there is no appetite. The appetite is fading in the big countries like France or Germany to send those troops. So we have to bear in mind that there is an agreement and we want this, but other options also have to be put on the table. All sorts of options: Finland, Sweden, Poland, but also investing more in our own defense. And Lithuania is making a decision to boost our own capabilities and to make it division level capabilities, because it's very important to withstand Russia and to avoid Bucha-like scenarios in Lithuania. Enlargement. Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO is super important for us, because it would partially help to avoid the closing Suwałki gap problem, other routes opening for NATO reinforcements. So it's very important, and I believe this will come true. It doesn't matter who wins the elections in Turkey, but after the elections we will be seeing some movement, except one caveat, which I'm a bit afraid: this thinking that the war is over and why we have to change, because the support to NATO in Sweden is beginning to drop. I hope it's not going to become a trend. more cooperation between the organizations and more cooperation between countries outside NATO, also in Asia Pacific, that will release some tension from the United States and would allow more presence of the United States in the region. That's very important. And I think that Baltic countries, for whom the presence of the United States in the region is vitally important, has also to be more involved in these countries politically, first of all, but why not, although we lack the capabilities, also showing our presence there. And last but not least, when we are talking about enlargements, another window of opportunity, there has to be something done with Ukraine. There were some promises for Ukraine, they were never fulfilled. There was Budapest, there was Bucharest, and there should be some messages and some security guarantees, because now there are a lot of talks about rebuilding Ukraine, and there is a nitty-gritty, and what I see that there is a lack of willingness on the business side to come to Ukraine and invest without any substantial security guarantees. And I think it is what the Western countries have to do, and use this window of opportunity to create these guarantees for the future of Ukraine and for the future of Europe. So here I stop.
Thanks so much, Margarita. Let's go straight over to you, Thomas, and give us your thoughts on, we have the ingredients we need, how do we cook them?
Yeah, I think that there's something very peculiar going on with NATO's deterrence posture in the Baltic region. And to demonstrate this, I will use Russia's probable thinking behind its invasion. Apparently, at some point, Ukraine became so important for Vladimir Putin personally that whatever plan was designed, it had to work. Not just it would work, but it had to. Ukraine was so important that Russia had to try. Now, NATO's presence, military presence, and deterrence posture in the Baltic region, I think follows similar logic. That, sure, Baltic states are NATO member states. They are covered by Article 5. There's no question about it. Okay, what can be practically done about that? So after the annexation of Crimea, let's provide them with a multinational battalion each. It must work. Not necessarily that it would, but it must work. Okay, since last year we are in a different world, now let's upgrade a little bit to a brigade. It must work. It must be sufficient. But is it? The Baltic states are going out of their way to increase their defense spending. In Latvia, we are bringing back conscription, well, a form of conscription. Edward, you are absolutely right. There are a number of capabilities that are needed, but air defense is terribly expensive. So can the three Baltic states afford that? And can they afford ammunition in sufficient quantities? Well, that's a big question. So I think that at the moment we're not thinking in terms of what needs to be done to deter Russia in the Baltic region, for sure, but instead we are relying on a gradual approach that every time Russia does something aggressive, there's slight change of NATO deterrence posture, there's an upgrade, but whether that's enough or not, I don't think there's anyone who really has a clue about that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Tony, just wrap us up on this one.
Thanks, Ed. Let me maybe tackle 3 points, one about Finland and Sweden, one about the EU, and one about
NATO. So just to think about what Finland and Sweden bring to the alliance, I mean, first of all, they bring a political message. I mean, this Northern European space, Nordic Baltic space, is now a single cohesive space in security terms. We'll all be members of NATO, we'll all be members of the EU. And just to kind of a little aside, is it wasn't very well noticed, but Denmark, in its response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, decided to integrate fully into CSDP. So this is another part of the jigsaw that is all coming together. Secondly, Finland and Sweden bring geography, and this is important for things like reinforcement routes. It's important for pre-positioning equipment. It's important for air bases and logistics support. And thirdly, they bring capability, and especially in the air and on the sea. Finland and Sweden are very capable modern forces. I've been talking quite a lot to Finns and Swedes recently. I think when it comes to land forces, they'll both, for different reasons, find some difficulties in satisfying fully NATO's expectations, at least at the start. But that's maybe a fairly small thing. Altogether, this means that the centre of gravity of the alliance is going to shift to the east and to the north. And that's a good thing, because we all tend to think alike. We can all kind of pull the alliance in the direction that we want to pull it. And to bounce off the theme of today, this what can the Baltic states do in Europe? I mean, this idea of kind of leading this response to Russia is maybe where the Baltic states are strongest. What we do need to avoid, however, in bringing Finland and Sweden to NATO, is this idea that it's now solved. Finland and Sweden are NATO members, so that corner of Europe, we don't need to worry about it anymore. So we need to be a little bit cautious to make sure that the rest of NATO, and in particular the Americans, remain engaged in the region. Secondly, I mean, Ed said, what do we as Europeans need to do when we're worrying about the prospect of a new MAGA president or America's shift to the Indo-Pacific regions? Margarita said it, we need to spend more and we need to spend better. And I think in this instance, we see maybe quite an important role for the EU. I would argue that institutionally, the EU has changed more than NATO in its response to the war in Ukraine. NATO has, of course, strengthened defence and deterrence, but it's doing more of the same that it's traditionally done. The EU has taken some really big steps forward in its role as a global actor. The military mission, the military assistance mission in Ukraine is a vast step up in CSDP. The sanctions policy, I mean, these are unprecedented in their scope and in their scale. Perhaps most importantly of all, the European Peace Facility and the use of EU money to buy weapons for Ukraine is really a huge step forward. And on the back of that, the Commission and the European Defence Agency are thinking about various ways in which the EU can become better at regulating the defence industry and at bringing nations together to cooperate in defence procurement. So we're beginning to see, I think, a slight sort of division of labour in that NATO will remain responsible for military operations, but the EU will take an important role as a capability provider for those operations. Whether that will last the next MAGA presidency, we'll see. Third point was on NATO and the Ukraine perspective from NATO. NATO, I've been really heartened to see the unity and the resolve, the cohesion that NATO has shown in its response to the war in Ukraine. Just 18 months ago, we were worried that NATO was going to have great difficulty in agreeing a new strategic concept at Madrid, because the divisions in the alliance were really very deep indeed. But that was all kind of blown away with Ukraine. And Russia has been surprised as well, and that's pretty clear. Throughout the war, Russia has blustered and complained about NATO countries' supply of weapons and equipment to Ukraine. And we've stepped up, we've escalated in our supply in terms of lethality and sophistication of equipment. So from small handheld portable weapons through export or pack stuff, through Western air defense and armored vehicles, and on to main battle tanks, and now even combat aircraft. And Russia's complained at every step, but it hasn't acted against NATO. It hasn't tried to interdict supply chains or to escalate the war in a direction beyond the country of Ukraine itself. And I think, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that NATO is as keen to avoid a war with us. Sorry, that Russia is as keen to avoid with us as we are to avoid a war with Russia. And when we think about Ukraine's future NATO perspective, that's a very important consideration that we need to keep in mind.